Okay, I'm here and we're going to do a little review of what we learned for the first half of this year in linguistics. I got some notes here, so I'm just going to run through them a little bit and bear with me. So in chapter 1, we looked at not all languages have the same parts, and some languages don't even have articles. In some languages, some prepositions turn into postpositions, and these are really interesting things, and they need to be known by teachers, just so that if you get kids coming in with different languages, you can somewhat understand that they may have different aspects of their language that don't really apply to ours. The traditional approach in teaching a second language has been to teach the grammar and vocabulary of the new language, while the traditional approach to teaching language is logical. It generally does not enable people to communicate in the language. Generally, it is only when they try to teach the grammar that they learn it. And that was interesting to learn as well. In chapter 1, we talked about Chomsky and how he argues that people acquire their first language naturally because the human brain is wired for language. Humans are born with a language acquisition device that allows us to, over time, form subconscious rules that we call internal grammar. But the question with his that still remains is if adults can then acquire a second language like a young child would, and that would be later addressed in our text and studies by Krashen. In order to make language understandable, a teacher needs to know about language and how language works. Then the teacher can make modifications in speech or writing to help aid students' comprehension. And we see this a lot, and that's what's really interesting about how these language studies have been going, is that we see that people who don't understand that language is they don't help students and they hurt students, and so it's really interesting to look at and read all this. As teachers, we want to encourage each other and other teachers to take a descriptive approach to language study because prescriptive approaches to natural phenomena like language just don't work. In chapter 2, we learned that the term emergent bilingual is more positive, and it emphasizes the ability humans have to expand their language resources and their communication potential. An English language learner sounds not very good, and emergent bilingual, it sounds like somebody who can have a various repertoire of languages and can learn in various contexts, so it sounds much better. We learned about different theories. We learned about imitation theory that is no longer accepted, but that theory said that children learn language through imitation. This fell out, though, because young children form sentences that don't make sense and that could never have been spoken by adults. So to say that they would imitate our language and then say different things that don't make any sense didn't line up. We talked about reinforcement theory, which is also no longer accepted, but says that children develop language through positive reinforcement of standard language forms, and they are corrected when they produce non-standard forms. And this kind of gets debunked with behaviors theory all at the same time. Behaviors theories was developed by Skinner, and it combines elements of imitation theory and reinforcement theory. Behaviorists believe that language is learned like anything else. Learning depends on the response of the individuals to the environment. The problem with behaviors theory are, if learning is a result of the environment acting on the child, and if learning environments vary, which they do, how can one account for the uniformity of language development sequence in children? And that's a really good point. If we're here in Ontario and we are a various culture of languages here, our language, the way that we develop English, should be different than people in Boise or even Portland if behaviorist view was accurate. If learning is the result of imitation and reinforcement, then why wouldn't other intelligent beings like apes also learn to speak? And that's really good. Apes are really smart, and it's been shown that they can learn. So to say that if we give them positive reinforcements like giving them food, or good things when they could imitate us, then they should also be able to speak, and we know that that doesn't work. And the last one that I'm going to give, the text gave a few more, but this is the last one that I really like. Close examination in children's language development shows that children don't simply imitate adults. If they did, they would never produce sentences like, I goed home yesterday, because they would never hear sentences like that from adults. Even adults who don't speak proper grammar at all don't say anything like that. And that is what really debunked behaviorist and reinforcement theory. In Chapter 2, we also discuss how children exposed to sign language, like children exposed to regular spoken language, go through the same stages. And so we can really see that no matter what kind of languages you're learning in the beginning, you can go through stages and you can acquire language, which was really cool. The theory of language acquisition that most languages support is the active construction of grammar theory. This theory holds that children invent the rules of grammar themselves. With what is innate is the ability to invent these rules, and that kind of backs up what Chomsky said, is when children have these innate abilities to form language and to form rules. So it kind of coincides with Chomsky. This theory states that children have an ability to find patterns in a language and develop subconscious rules that allow them to comprehend and produce language that follows the pattern. So that also kind of encompasses crashing a little bit, and so it's probably a broader scope of more of these theorists, and it's probably mashed into one, and we've gotten the best that we can out of it. In Chapter 3, we learn that there are two views of language and writing acquisition. There's the learning view and the acquisition view. And in the learning view, the goal of instruction is to produce students who speak and understand the language. This is best accomplished by teaching each part of language, like pronunciation, grammar, then vocabulary, directly and systematically. Students practice language by engaging in oral drills and written exercises, and teachers correct errors immediately. So this is the teacher-centered classroom of way back in the day that all of us probably went through. We sat there and we did papers, turned them in, teacher corrected them, and we constantly did that. The acquisition view, the goal of instruction is to enable students to use language for a variety of academic purposes. Students often work in pairs or small groups. Teachers help students say what they want to say and also give them strategies so they can continue to communicate when they don't have the linguistic resources. And so this is more of the student-centered view of today's classrooms, and I really like this view. Maybe I'm too old school, or I grew up in the learning view too much. I still do like parts of the learning view, but I think a combination of both, and that is one of our discussion boards, and it was, I think, one of the questions on our midterm, and I like them both. To be an effective teacher, I think you have to use skills and strategies from both, because students have been successful in both, and to pull the pros out of both and use them in a classroom, it would be stupid not to. In Chapter 3, we also learned about Krashen's theory, or we reviewed it. His 5 theories. He has the learning acquisition hypothesis that says that students in high school, students that are older, they can learn language where they chunk up language into manageable chunks, and they try to memorize and practice the different patterns. And it works for some people. It doesn't work for a lot of people. That's why most people aren't successful in high school Spanish or college Spanish courses, because it's all about memory. It's not really about learning the language. And then it says students can acquire language as well. So Krashen identifies that you can do both. And in some of Krashen's theories, learning the language needs to take place. He's not all about acquisition. And that was discussed in Chapter 3. Students acquiring a language may not even be aware that they are picking up vocabulary or sentence structure. Acquisition happens when students use language in a variety of purposes. Acquisition can take place in or outside of the school. So this would be the example of an adult who goes on a mission or studies abroad and learns a language because they're constantly immersed in the culture and the language, and they have to use it in various contexts. So both learning and acquisition can both take place. Then he said he has the natural order hypothesis that really says when you're acquiring a language, you're going to go through natural stages, and they're predictable. He also has the monitor hypothesis that says if I'm learning a new language, I'm going to understand the rules, and I am going to monitor my speech and my writing, and I'm going to constantly change those as I get better, as I use the language, kind of like an ongoing self-assessment. And he has the effective filter hypothesis that says if the situation is a little too stressful, or the learner doesn't feel safe, and they're getting comprehensible input, and that's another one. I think I might have just skipped it, but another one is the input hypothesis that says you need to provide a learner with comprehensible input, and if a situation provides a student with a lot of stress, even if you have comprehensible input, their effective filter is going to go up. The comprehensible input is not going to get to the language acquisition device that was laid forth by Chomsky, and then they won't learn. And so those are the two most important learning theories that I think comes from these chapters, is that we need to remember that kids need to feel safe, and they don't need a lot of anxiety. And we need to provide them with a classroom atmosphere that gives them this kind of learning abilities. In Chapter 3, we also see that researchers say that a second language is more easily learned in the critical period. And this is placed from birth to about 6 years old. And once we get away from that, as students get away from that, 6, 7, 8, maybe they'll be okay. They can probably do it. But as they get away from the critical period, learning a language is going to be hard because our brain fossilizes. And the neurons in our brain, some die because we don't use them as a second language, and some get stronger with our first language, and to be able to make connections between the two get harder as we get older. In Chapter 4, we discussed minimal pairs, and we also learned that no language has a writing system that uniquely represents each sound in that language. That is, no alphabet has a one-to-one correspondence between sounds and letters. Instead, one letter may represent different sounds, and one sound may be represented by different letter sequencing. In Chapter 4, we also looked at the places of articulation in the mouth, like the bilabial, the labiodentals, interdental, alveolar, alveoplatal, velar, and the glottal, and they just work forward to backwards with bilabial here and glottal being down here. What's really great is we also looked at manner of articulation, which I think is much more important than the 7 that I just went over. I think being able to, well, I wouldn't say much more important, but I would say that they both need to be understood and to help a child speak. Such things like voiced or voiceless stops, nasals, fricatives, affricates, approximates, and glides. And I probably need to get better using those words, but being able to combine those two parts to help a student learn and articulate new language is going to be very important down the road. In Chapter 5, we looked at phonological awareness, and we learned that is the ability to distinguish larger units of speech, such as words and syllables. Phonemic awareness is a type of phonological awareness. It is the ability to identify the phonemes in a word and manipulate them in various ways, such as adding a phoneme, deleting a phoneme, or substituting one phoneme for another one. In Chapter 6, we looked at the learning and acquisition view of spelling. Teachers who took a learning view assume that spelling should be taught in a constant and systematic way. Again, this is the definite teacher-centered type of classroom that we probably all grew up in. The learning view, which is predominant in American schools, teachers assign lists of words for students to study. They practice using these words in different ways. Teachers may ask students to write each word several times a week, or use the word in a sentence and then give a test at the end of the week. And then there's the acquisition approach, which assumes that a student write for real purposes, and they will gradually use more convention form of spelling as they get better and use it more. Teachers who take an acquisition view do involve students in activities that help them focus on words. They may discuss different spellings. They may also involve students in linguistic investigations to help students discover common spelling pattern. Again, I'm going to go back to it. I think they're both really important, and I think that to be a successful teacher, we need to use aspects of both views, learning and acquisition. In Chapter 6, we also learned that in English, while letters representing vowel phonemes differentiate between many words, the letters representing vowels are not as important as those representing consonants. Most English speakers have trouble reading a sentence in which the consonants are deleted, but most readers can decipher the same sentence with the vowels deleted. Also, another very interesting thing to know, especially if you're going to be in the younger grades where kids will struggle with reading, that is something that we should know to help them with their reading problems. We also learned that some word spellings in our language reflect their origin or where they were once pronounced differently in another time period of English. Also very important, and I think even now this was kind of the wake-up call, and I'm 22 years old and I've went through tons of school, but I've always come across words and I thought, wow, that's really dumb. Why would they spell it that way? And now knowing that there's a reason for spellings and they reflect certain things in a word, I think that's important. I think we should address that with our students because it's really eye-opening. English, interestingly, also has words like medical and medicine, in which the same letter C is used to represent two different sounds. And that goes into my next point. Writing systems are designed to serve two different groups of people, writers and readers. Changes that would make writing easier, if you make changes to make writing easier, it would make reading tougher. And if we made changes to make reading easier, it would probably make writing tougher. And just like with medicine and medical, if you changed medicine, it probably wouldn't change medical, even though those two words are definitely related. We also learned about Jean Berko-Gleason and her WUG test that she invented in the 50s. And the WUG test is really important, and we need to know it, especially if we're going to be working with language learners. The WUG test would ask students questions about a picture or an object, about plurality and other forms of words, and students would be able to change the words, even though they were new words, to form the rules that they already formed in their head about the language, which is so important. And that kind of backs up Chomsky, how students form these rules, they form them for themselves, and even if they're not a proficient English speaker, they can apply the rules that they know to new situations, and that's really important because it also shows us that why those other things like behaviors and imitation theory can't be possible. We also learned about Cummins and his development of Bix and Cal. This distinguishes the difference between the ability to have communicative competence in a normal social setting that uses very little academic language, if any at all, and the ability of a learner to be able to understand and use academic language for learning. So Bix is, your basic interpersonal communication skills, and CALP is your cognitive academic language proficiency. And they're two different forms of the spectrum on language. And we need to understand that if a kid may be able to go out to recess and speak English just fine with his friends and communicate and play games, but when they get into the classroom and their anxiety comes up and the affective filter goes up, their CALP might be a lot different. And so we can't use both situations as kind of a measuring tool to place that student. We need to work with the student in both. Those are my notes that I had from this term. I went back and looked at everything. And, if I missed something, let me know. I'd love to hear it. Thank you, guys.